Imagine a place where the sun does not rise for months, a place where the wind cuts through the air like a blade, and the temperature can fall so low that exposed skin freezes in less than a minute. A place where the sea itself turns to stone, stretching white and silent to the horizon, and where the only sound for miles is the soft groan of shifting ice beneath your feet. This is not the surface of another planet. This is not a forgotten corner of some distant frozen moon. This is Earth. This is the Arctic. And against every law of survival that we think we understand, people have lived here, thrived here, and built entire civilizations here for thousands of years. They are the Inuit, the people of the ice, the hunters of the long night, the keepers of stories older than most nations on this planet. While empires rose and fell across warmer lands, while pyramids were built and forgotten, while continents were mapped and remapped by explorers who claimed to know the world, the Inuit were quietly mastering the most unforgiving environment on Earth. They learned to read the language of the wind. They learned to listen to the silence of the snow. They learned to find food where there seemed to be none, to build shelter from the very thing that could kill them, and to pass down knowledge so precise, so finely tuned to their world that even modern science still struggles to match it. But how did they do it? How did a people, with no metal, no written language for most of their history, and no contact with the great civilizations of the South, survive in a place where modern explorers, with all their maps and tools and supplies, have frozen to death within weeks? What did they know that we do not? What did they see in the snow, in the stars, in the eyes of a polar bear, that allowed them to call this terrifying world their home? Today, we are going on a journey across thousands of years and thousands of miles of frozen ocean, a journey into the igloos and the kayaks, into the chants of throat singers and the whispered prayers of shamans, a journey into a way of life that is both ancient and astonishingly modern, both fragile and unbreakable. This is the story of the Inuit, the indigenous people of the Arctic. And by the time this story ends, you may never look at snow or silence or the human spirit the same way again. To understand the Inuit, you must first understand the world they call home. Picture a vast, almost unimaginable stretch of land and frozen sea that wraps around the very top of our planet like a crown of ice. This is the Arctic. It begins where the trees end, where the forests thin out into nothing, and where the ground itself remains frozen all year round, a layer of permanent ice known as permafrost. From here, the land rolls out in every direction, covered in snow for most of the year, broken only by jagged mountains, glittering glaciers, and the dark, restless waters of the polar sea. The Arctic is not one country. It is a region shared by many. It stretches across the northern reaches of Alaska in the United States, sweeps through the entire top of Canada, covers nearly all of Greenland, and reaches into parts of northern Russia and Siberia. This is the homeland of the Inuit, not a single nation, but a vast network of communities, scattered across thousands of miles, connected by a shared language, a shared history, and a shared understanding of what it means to live at the edge of the world. The conditions here are unlike anywhere else on Earth. In the depths of winter, the sun disappears entirely. For weeks, sometimes months, the world is wrapped in a deep blue-black darkness, broken only by the moon, the stars, and the ghostly green ribbons of the northern lights dancing across the sky. Then, in the height of summer, the opposite happens. The sun refuses to set. It hangs low on the horizon for 24 hours a day, casting a strange golden light over a land that briefly explodes into life. Wildflowers bloom. Birds return in great clouds. Rivers thaw and rush toward the sea. And then, just as quickly, the cold returns, and the world freezes once more. The temperatures here are almost beyond belief. In the harshest months, the air can drop to -50 degrees Celsius, sometimes even lower. At those temperatures, boiling water thrown into the air turns to ice crystals before it hits the ground. Metal becomes brittle, machines fail, And yet, in this very environment, the Inuit have built homes, raised children, sung songs, and told stories for countless generations. The land itself is a paradox. To an outsider, it might seem empty, lifeless, a frozen wasteland. But to the Inuit, it is alive in every direction. The sea is full of seals and whales and walrus. The tundra is home to caribou, musk oxen, and Arctic foxes. The skies fill in their season with snow geese and ptarmigan. Polar bears prowl the ice. Beluga whales sing beneath the frozen surface. For those who know how to read it, the Arctic is not empty at all. It is one of the richest hunting grounds on Earth. The trick, of course, is knowing how to read it. And that is exactly what the Inuit have spent thousands of years learning to do. The word Inuit itself is important. In their own language, Inuktitut, it simply means the people. A single person is called an Inuk. Two people are Inuuk. And many people, the people as a whole, are Inuit. For a long time, outsiders called them by another name, Eskimo. That word, while still used in some places, is generally avoided today. Many Inuit consider it inaccurate or even offensive, depending on where they live. The Inuit prefer to be called what they have always called themselves, the people. And there is a quiet power in that name. It speaks of identity, of belonging, of a connection to a place and a way of life that has endured against impossible odds. Today, there are roughly 180,000 Inuit spread across the Arctic. The largest populations live in Greenland, where they make up the majority of the country, and in Canada, where they are concentrated in regions like Nunavut, Nunavik, and the Inuvialuit settlement region. In Alaska, the closely related Inupiat and Yupik peoples live across the northern and western coasts. And in the far east of Russia, on the windswept Chukotka Peninsula, smaller communities of Yupik continue to hold on to their ancient traditions. Although these groups have their own dialects and customs, they share a deep cultural and linguistic heritage that stretches back thousands of years. Their language, in its many forms, is one of the most fascinating in the world. It is a language built for the Arctic. It has dozens of words for snow, each describing a different kind, a different texture, a different condition. There are words for snow that is good for building, snow that is dangerous to walk on, snow that signals a coming storm. There are words for the way light bends across the ice, for the sound of a seal beneath the surface, for the feeling of wind on bare skin. To speak Inuktitut, or Inupiaq, or Yupik, is to think in a way that is shaped entirely by the land itself. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand before we go any further. The Inuit are not simply people who happen to live in the Arctic. They are people who have become part of the Arctic. Their bodies, their tools, their stories, their songs, their very way of seeing the world, have all been shaped by the ice and the wind and the long, dark winters. To remove them from this land would be to remove a piece of the land itself. So now, with the stage set, with the cold air settling around us and the wind whispering across the snow, we begin to ask the deeper questions. Where did the Inuit come from? How did they arrive in this frozen world? And what ancient journey brought them to the top of our planet, where they have remained, against all odds, for thousands of years? To find the beginning of the Inuit story, we must travel far back in time, to a world that no longer exists. Picture the Earth around 15,000 years ago, near the end of the last great ice age. Sea levels were much lower than they are today. So much of the planet's water was locked up in massive glaciers that the oceans themselves had retreated, exposing land that is now buried beneath the waves. And in one particular place, between what we now call Siberia and Alaska, a wide, grassy plain stretched across the freezing sea. Scientists call it Beringia. The people who lived there simply called it home. Across this lost land, ancient humans walked. They were hunters, following the great herds of mammoth and bison and caribou that grazed the frozen plains. Slowly, generation by generation, they pushed eastward. they crossed Beringia and entered a new continent, a land that no human eye had ever seen. They were the first Americans. And from them, every indigenous people of the Americas would eventually descend. But the ancestors of the Inuit were not among those first travelers. Their story would come later, much later, and it would unfold in a very different way. The Inuit, as we know them today, are the descendants of a people called the Thule. The Thule were not the first to live in the Arctic. Before them came other groups, other cultures, who tried and, in many cases, failed to survive in the far north. The earliest of these were the people of the pre-Dorset and Dorset cultures, who lived across the Canadian Arctic and Greenland for thousands of years. The Dorset were a remarkable people. They hunted seals through holes in the ice. They carved tiny, beautiful figures from bone and ivory. They lived in small, scattered groups, and they survived in conditions that would have killed almost anyone else. But around 1,000 years ago, something changed. The climate began to shift, the ice patterns moved, new animals appeared, and from the west, a new people began to arrive. The Thule came from the coasts of Alaska, around the year 900 to 1000 of the Common Era. They were not just survivors, they were innovators. They had developed extraordinary new technologies that allowed them to hunt the largest animals in the sea. They had the kayak, a sleek, swift boat made of sealskin stretched over a frame of bone or driftwood. They had the umiak, a larger open boat used for hunting whales. They had the dog sled, pulled by teams of strong, intelligent dogs that could travel hundreds of miles across the ice. And most importantly, they had the harpoon, a weapon so cleverly designed that it could bring down a bowhead whale weighing more than 60 tons. With these tools, the Thule moved east at a remarkable pace. Within just a few centuries, they had spread all the way across the Canadian Arctic, into Greenland, and to the very edges of the inhabitable world. As they moved, they encountered the Dorset. Exactly what happened next is still debated by historians and archaeologists. Some believe the two peoples lived side by side for a time. Others believe the Dorset were absorbed, or pushed out, or simply faded away as the climate and the new arrivals reshaped the land. Whatever the truth, by around the year 1400, the Dorset were gone. And the Thule, the ancestors of today's Inuit, had become the masters of the Arctic. Now here is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Around the same time the Thule were spreading across the eastern Arctic, another group of people arrived in the region from a completely different direction. From the south, from across the Atlantic Ocean. They were the Norse, the Vikings. Around the year 980, a Norse explorer named Eric the Red sailed from Iceland and established a settlement on the southern coast of Greenland. For nearly 500 years, the Norse lived in Greenland, building farms, churches, and small towns. And for at least part of that time, they shared the island with the Inuit. The two cultures could not have been more different. The Norse were farmers, raising sheep and cattle in the brief Greenland summers. The Inuit were hunters, masters of the sea and the ice. The Norse wore wool. The Inuit wore sealskin and caribou hide. The Norse built houses of stone and turf. The Inuit built shelters of snow and bone. And while there are scattered records of contact between the two peoples, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, the truth is that history favored the Inuit. As the climate cooled in what is now called the Little Ice Age, the Norse settlements began to fail. Their crops would not grow. Their livestock died. Their ships could no longer reach them through the thickening sea ice. And one by one, the Norse colonies in Greenland were abandoned, their people either dying out or returning to Europe. The Inuit, meanwhile, kept living, kept hunting, kept thriving in the very conditions that had defeated the Vikings. For the next several centuries, the Inuit were left largely alone. The Arctic, with its ice and its darkness and its endless cold, was simply too forbidding for most outsiders to penetrate. The Inuit continued their ancient way of life, hunting whales and seals, traveling by kayak and dog sled, telling their stories around oil lamps in the long polar night. They had no idea of the great changes happening in the world to the south. They did not know that empires were rising and falling. They did not know that ships were beginning to sail farther and farther into the unknown, searching for new lands, new routes, new fortunes. But by the 1600s, that isolation began to break. European explorers, hungry for a northwest passage that might lead them to the riches of Asia, began pushing into Arctic waters. Names like Martin Frobisher, Henry Hudson, and William Baffin appeared on maps drawn over the homelands of the Inuit. Most of these expeditions ended in disaster. Ships were crushed by ice. Crews froze to death. Some explorers vanished entirely, swallowed by the white silence. And yet, the Inuit watched it all. They sometimes traded with the strangers. They sometimes helped them. They sometimes simply stood on the shore and wondered what kind of people would sail into a world they so clearly did not understand. By the 1700s and 1800s, contact became more constant. European and American whalers began hunting in Arctic waters, drawn by the enormous bowhead whales that the Inuit had hunted for centuries. With the whalers came new tools, new weapons, new diseases. Christian missionaries followed, bringing churches and schools and a new way of seeing the world. Traders set up posts where Inuit hunters could exchange furs for rifles, tea, sugar, and tobacco. The old, isolated world of the Arctic was beginning to change forever. These changes brought benefits, but they also brought devastation. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis swept through Inuit communities, killing entire families in a matter of weeks. Traditional hunting patterns were disrupted as commercial whalers slaughtered the great whales by the thousands. New laws and borders, drawn by distant governments, began to divide the Inuit world into pieces. And yet, through all of it, the Inuit endured. They adapted, as they had always adapted. They took what was useful from the new world and kept what was sacred from the old. They learned new languages without forgetting their own. They lost much, but they did not lose themselves. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Inuit stood at a crossroads. The ancient ways were still alive, still strong, still passed from elder to child around the warm light of the seal oil lamp. But the modern world was at the door. Airplanes were beginning to fly overhead. Radios were beginning to crackle to life. And the long, slow dance between tradition and change was about to enter its most challenging chapter yet. Now let us step inside that ancient world. Let us walk for a while in the footsteps of an Inuit family and see what daily life truly looked like in a place where every breath, every meal, every moment of warmth was hard-won. Because to understand the Inuit, you must understand that survival in the Arctic was not a single act of bravery. It was 1,000 small acts of intelligence, repeated every single day, for an entire lifetime. Daily life began, as it does for most people, with the question of food. But in the Arctic, food was not something you could grow. There were no fields of grain, no orchards of fruit, no gardens of vegetables. The ground was frozen solid for most of the year, and even in the brief summer, the soil was too thin and too cold to farm. Everything the Inuit ate had to be hunted, fished, or gathered from a land that gave up its gifts only to those who understood it deeply. And so, the hunt was not just a part of life. The hunt was life itself. The most important animal in the Inuit world was the seal. Seals provided almost everything a family needed. Their meat was rich and full of fat, perfect for keeping the body warm in the brutal cold. Their blubber could be burned in stone lamps to provide light and heat. Their skins could be turned into boots, coats, tents, and the covering of kayaks. Their bones became tools. Their sinews became thread. Even their stomachs were used as containers. Nothing was wasted. Not a single piece. To hunt a seal was to bring home a small, warm miracle, but hunting seals was no easy task. In the winter, seals lived under the sea ice, coming up to breathe through small holes they kept open with their claws. An Inuit hunter would walk for miles across the frozen sea, searching for these breathing holes, sometimes guided by a specially trained dog who could smell the seal beneath the ice. When a hole was found, the hunter would stand absolutely still, sometimes for hours, in temperatures that could freeze a man's eyelashes shut. He would hold his harpoon ready, listening, waiting, barely breathing himself. And when the seal finally rose to take a breath, the hunter had only a single silent moment to strike. One movement, one chance. If he succeeded, his family would eat for days. If he failed, he would walk home empty-handed across the ice, hoping the next hole would bring better luck. In the summer, when the ice broke up and the sea opened, the hunting changed. Now the Inuit would slide their kayaks into the cold water and paddle out among the floating ice. The kayak itself was a marvel of engineering. Light, fast, and almost silent, it was built to fit the hunter like a glove. The frame was made of driftwood or whalebone, lashed together with sinew. The covering was sealskin, stretched tight and sewn so carefully that not a single drop of water could enter. The hunter wore a special waterproof jacket made from seal intestines, which he tied around the rim of the kayak, sealing himself inside. Even if the boat rolled completely over in the icy water, he could right himself with a sweep of his paddle and continue on his way. With the kayak, the Inuit could chase seals, walrus, and even whales across the open sea. For the largest hunts, the Inuit used a different boat, the umiak. It was an open vessel, much larger than the kayak, capable of carrying a whole crew of hunters and their equipment. The umiak was used to hunt the bowhead whale, an animal so massive that a single one could feed an entire village for an entire year. A bowhead whale could weigh more than 60 tons. Imagine the courage it took to paddle out into the freezing sea in a small skin boat and confront a creature that size, armed with nothing but harpoons and ropes. And yet the Inuit did it, again and again, for thousands of years. When a whale was finally taken, the entire community would gather on the shore. Men, women, and children would work together to butcher the great animal, sharing the meat and blubber according to ancient rules of fairness. There was singing, there was feasting, there was deep, quiet gratitude for the gift of so much life. On land, the Inuit hunted other animals too. The caribou was perhaps the most important of these. Vast herds of caribou migrated across the tundra each year, and the Inuit timed their movements to follow them. Caribou meat was lean and nourishing. Caribou hide was the warmest material in the Arctic, used to make winter clothing. The hollow hairs of the caribou trapped air, creating natural insulation that no modern fabric has ever truly matched. A coat made of caribou hide, sewn by a skilled Inuit woman, could keep a hunter alive in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. And that brings us to one of the most important parts of Inuit daily life: clothing. In a world where the cold could kill you, what you wore was not a matter of fashion. It was a matter of life and death. Inuit clothing was, without exaggeration, some of the most sophisticated cold-weather gear ever created by any culture, anywhere on Earth. It was so effective that even modern Arctic explorers, with all their high-tech jackets and synthetic fibers, often admit that traditional Inuit clothing is still the warmest thing you can wear in the polar regions. The system was based on layering. A person would wear 2 layers of caribou hide, one with the fur turned inward against the skin, and one with the fur turned outward against the wind. Between these layers, a pocket of warm air would form, holding the body's heat close. The hood of the parka was lined with wolverine or wolf fur, because, remarkably, frost will not stick to those particular furs the way it sticks to others. This kept the hunter's face protected even in the worst storms. On the feet, they wore kamik, soft boots made of sealskin, sometimes with caribou fur on the inside. The soles were made of tougher hide and chewed by the women of the family until they were perfectly soft and waterproof. Yes, chewed. The women of the Inuit world spent countless hours softening boot soles with their teeth, and the condition of those teeth, often worn down to the gums by old age, was a quiet testimony to their lifelong labor of love. Now, let us turn to the homes themselves. When most people think of the Inuit, they picture the igloo. And it is true, the igloo is one of the most extraordinary inventions in all of human history. But the igloo was not the only home the Inuit built, and it was not even the most common. The igloo was primarily a winter shelter, used during long hunting trips or when traveling far from a permanent camp. It was built from blocks of hard, dry snow, cut with a special knife and stacked in a rising spiral. A skilled builder could put up an igloo in just a few hours, even in the middle of a blizzard. Once finished, the snow walls trapped body heat so effectively that the inside temperature could rise to 20 degrees Celsius or more, while outside the wind howled at -40. A small lamp burning seal oil provided light, warmth, and a way to cook. Children were born in igloos. Stories were told in igloos. Entire winters were lived inside walls of snow, in homes that would melt away come spring. But the Inuit also had other dwellings. In the autumn and winter, when families gathered in larger settlements, they often lived in karmaks, semi-underground houses built of stone, sod, and whalebone, covered with hides. These were warmer, more permanent, and could shelter several families together. In summer, when the family followed the caribou or fished along the rivers, they used skin tents, called tupiks, that could be moved easily from place to place. The Inuit, you see, were not rigid in their building. They were flexible. They had a different home for every season, every purpose, every condition the Arctic could throw at them. Let us talk now about travel. In a land so vast and so empty, getting from one place to another was an enormous part of daily life. And the Inuit were among the greatest travelers in human history. In the winter, they used dog sleds, called kamutiks. The sled itself was a long, simple frame, but the design was ingenious. The runners were sometimes made of frozen fish wrapped in sealskin and coated with a layer of ice, allowing the sled to glide almost effortlessly over the snow. Pulling the sled was a team of dogs, the legendary Kimik, the Canadian Inuit dog. These animals were not pets in the way we think of pets today. They were partners. They were colleagues. They could pull heavy loads for hundreds of miles, find their way home through blinding storms, and warn their owners of polar bears and thin ice. A good lead dog was worth more than gold. In the summer, when the snow melted and the sleds could no longer be used, travel happened by water. The kayak and the umiak became the highways of the Arctic. Inuit families would travel hundreds of miles each year, moving between hunting grounds, fishing rivers, and gathering places. They mapped the entire Arctic in their minds, passing knowledge of routes and currents and dangerous places from one generation to the next, all without writing a single word on paper. Now, let us look inside the family. The roles within an Inuit household were clearly defined, but they were not rigid in the way many outsiders have assumed. Men were the primary hunters, traveling far from home to bring back food. Women were the heart of the household, responsible for preparing food, sewing clothing, raising children, and maintaining the home. But these roles were partners, not rulers and servants. A man could not survive without a woman to make his clothing. A woman could not feed her family without a man to bring home the seal. The Inuit understood, perhaps better than many modern societies, that men and women were simply different parts of the same whole. Without one, the other could not live. Children were treasured beyond measure. In a land where infant mortality was high, where a single bad winter could take half a community, every child was a precious gift. Children were rarely punished harshly. Instead, they were taught by example, by storytelling, by gentle correction. From a very young age, boys were taken on hunting trips, learning to read the ice, the weather, the behavior of animals. Girls were taught to sew, to prepare skins, to manage the household. And both boys and girls were raised on the stories of their elders, stories that contained every lesson they would ever need to know about how to live well in the Arctic. Food preparation was another art form. With no refrigerators and no salt, the Inuit had to find clever ways to preserve their meat. They would dry it in the cold air, freeze it deep in the permafrost, or ferment it in special pits to create dishes like kiviak, a traditional Greenlandic delicacy made from small birds fermented inside a sealskin. Much of the meat was eaten raw, which may sound shocking, but there was a deep wisdom in this. Cooking destroyed certain vitamins, especially vitamin C, that were essential for survival in a land with no fresh fruits or vegetables. By eating raw meat, especially the liver and other organs, the Inuit got all the nutrition they needed. Their diet, strange as it might sound, was perfectly suited to their environment. It was so well suited, in fact, that traditional Inuit had almost none of the diseases, like heart disease and diabetes, that plague modern industrial societies. A typical day in an Inuit camp followed a rhythm shaped by the seasons. In winter, when the days were short or the sun did not rise at all, families spent long hours together inside the igloo or karmak. The men would repair their tools, sharpen their harpoons, and plan the next hunt. The women would sew, tend the lamps, and cook. The children would listen to the elders telling stories, ancient stories of heroes and spirits, stories that taught them everything from how to hunt a seal to how to behave with kindness toward others. In summer, when the sun never set, life burst into activity. Families traveled, hunted, fished, and gathered. They would visit other camps, exchange news, find marriage partners, and trade goods. The summer was for living loudly. The winter was for living deeply. And running through all of this, woven into every action of every day, was the principle of sharing. The Inuit had no concept of accumulating private wealth in the way other cultures did. A successful hunter did not keep his catch for himself. He shared it. The first cuts of a seal or a caribou were given to the elders, to the widows, to those who could not hunt for themselves. A good hunter was not the one who brought home the most. He was the one who fed the most people. There was a saying among the Inuit that the best place to store your meat was in someone else's stomach. Because tomorrow, when you returned empty-handed from the hunt, that person would share their meat with you. Generosity was not a virtue, it was a survival strategy. And it was the glue that held entire communities together against the crushing isolation of the Arctic. There were no kings among the Inuit, no chiefs in the way other indigenous cultures had them. Decisions were made by consensus, by discussion, by the quiet authority of elders whose long lives had earned them the right to be heard. If a person caused trouble, they were not punished by violence or imprisonment. They were spoken to. They were guided. And if all else failed, they might be quietly excluded from the group. A punishment that, in the Arctic, could be a death sentence. But this rarely happened. The Inuit understood that survival depended on cooperation, on harmony, on every person doing their part. There was simply no room in such a difficult world for selfishness or cruelty. This was daily life among the Inuit. It was not easy. It was never easy. But it was also not a life of constant suffering, as outsiders sometimes imagined. It was a life of skill, of knowledge, of laughter and song, and deep connection to family and place. It was a life that asked everything of a person and gave everything in return. And from this daily rhythm, from this 1,000-year dance with the ice and the sea, came the rich, beautiful culture that we will explore next. A culture of music and art and story, of belief and ceremony that turned the hardest place on earth into a true and beloved home. If daily life among the Inuit was about the body, about food and shelter and survival, then their culture was about the soul. Because no people, no matter how skilled at hunting, no matter how clever with tools, can live by survival alone. Human beings need more than warmth and meat. They need meaning. They need beauty. They need stories that explain who they are and where they belong. And the Inuit, despite living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, built a culture so rich, so deep, and so full of wonder that it can take your breath away. Let us begin with sound. Because in a land where the wind can howl for days, where the silence of the snow can feel like a weight upon the chest, sound is sacred. And the Inuit have one of the most extraordinary musical traditions in the entire world. It is called katajak, throat singing. If you have never heard it, no description can quite prepare you for the experience. Imagine two women standing face to face, almost close enough to touch noses. They lock eyes. They begin to breathe in a strange, rhythmic pattern, exchanging deep, guttural sounds back and forth, almost like a conversation between two ancient instruments. One leads, the other follows. The sounds layer over each other, weaving together into something that feels less like music and more like a force of nature. It can imitate the call of a goose, the breath of a sled dog, the rush of wind through a valley. And the goal, often, is not to perform a song, but to play a game. The two singers continue until one of them either runs out of breath, stumbles over the rhythm, or, most often, breaks into laughter. The one who laughs first loses, and the laughter after such intense focus is half the joy of the whole experience. Throat singing was traditionally performed by women, often while the men were away on long hunts. It was a way to pass the time, to bond with friends, to fill the long Arctic evenings with something more than silence. For a long time, this beautiful art was suppressed by missionaries who considered it strange or even sinful. For decades, it nearly disappeared. But today, throat singing is experiencing a powerful revival. Young Inuit women are learning it from their grandmothers, recording it, performing it on stages around the world. The voices that once filled small snow houses now fill concert halls, and the ancient sound of the Arctic is being heard once again. Alongside throat singing came another deeply important musical tradition: the drum dance. The Inuit drum, called the kilat, is a large, flat, round instrument made of caribou hide stretched over a wooden frame. It is held by a handle and struck on the rim, not the surface, with a wooden stick. The sound is deep and resonant, a slow, steady heartbeat that fills the space around it. Drum dances were held to mark important occasions, to celebrate a successful hunt, to welcome guests, to honor the dead. The dancer would move in a rhythmic, almost trance-like motion, while singing songs that had been passed down for generations. Some songs told the story of a great hunt. Others remembered an ancestor. Some were funny, poking gentle fun at neighbors and friends. Others were deeply spiritual, calling upon the spirits of the land and sea. The drum dance was, and still is, one of the purest expressions of the Inuit soul. Now, if music was the voice of the culture, then storytelling was its memory. Without a written language for most of their history, the Inuit kept everything they knew in their stories. Every lesson, every history, every law, every piece of practical knowledge was encoded in tales that elders told to children, who would one day tell them to their own children. These stories were not entertainment in the casual sense. They were libraries. They were schools. They were the very glue that held the culture together across thousands of miles and thousands of years. There were stories of how the world began, of how the sun and the moon came to be, of why the raven is black and why the loon has a striped neck. There were stories of giants and little people who lived hidden beneath the snow. Stories of brave hunters who outwitted polar bears and foolish ones who paid for their pride. Stories that warned children about dangerous places, about thin ice, about strangers who might not be what they seemed. And there were stories that simply made people laugh, long, winding tales told around the lamp on cold nights, stretching for hours, sometimes for days, with new pieces added each evening. The elders who told these stories held a position of immense respect. In the Inuit world, age was not a weakness. It was a treasure. An old man or woman had survived. They had seen the seasons turn many times. They had hunted, raised children, lost loved ones, and learned the deep truths that only time can teach. To listen to an elder was to receive a gift more valuable than gold. And the elders themselves understood the weight of this duty. They spoke carefully. They chose their words with patience. They never wasted breath on what was not important. Even today, in modern Inuit communities, the voice of an elder still carries a weight that no government title or modern degree can match. Now let us turn to the arts. The visual culture of the Inuit is one of the most distinctive in the world, and it has captured the imagination of art lovers across the globe. Inuit carvers worked in materials that were available to them in the Arctic: stone, bone, ivory, and antler. With incredible patience and skill, they could turn a piece of dark soapstone into a polar bear in mid-stride, or a walrus tusk into a tiny, perfect seal. The carvings often showed the animals of the Arctic, the hunters, the spirits, the everyday scenes of Inuit life. Each piece was a small story, frozen in stone, waiting to be read by anyone who held it. Soapstone carving in particular has become world famous. Galleries in Toronto, New York, London, and Tokyo display Inuit carvings as treasured works of art. But the tradition is not just about beauty. For the Inuit, carving was and still is a way of thinking, a way of remembering, a way of releasing the spirit that the carver believes is already inside the stone. There is an old saying among Inuit artists that the carver does not create the figure. The figure is already there, waiting inside the stone, and the carver simply removes what does not belong until the spirit is set free. And then there is one of the most iconic symbols of the Inuit world, the Inuksuk. You may have seen one without even knowing it. The Inuksuk is a stone figure, made by stacking rocks in a particular way, often shaped like a person with arms outstretched. The plural is Inuksut. These stone figures were built across the Arctic for thousands of years, and they served many purposes. Some marked good hunting grounds. Some pointed the way to safe travel routes. Some were memorials, built to honor a person who had died. And some were simply messages, left by one traveler to another saying, "I was here. You are not alone." In a land with no trees, no signposts, no permanent landmarks beyond the great mountains and the sea, the Inuksuk was a way of writing on the world itself. A way of saying, "This place matters." A way of leaving behind something that would last long after the snow had covered every footprint. Today, the Inuksuk has become a symbol recognized around the world. It even appeared as the emblem of the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. But in its original meaning, every Inuksuk was a quiet act of human kindness. A gift from one Inuit to the next, across the long stretch of time. Beyond carving, the Inuit also had a rich tradition of clothing as art. The parkas, boots, and mittens made by Inuit women were not just functional. They were beautiful. Patterns were carefully designed, using different colors of fur, decorative trim, and intricate stitching. A skilled seamstress could be recognized by her work alone. Each region, each family, even each individual had distinctive patterns, almost like a signature written in fur. To wear an Inuit parka was to wear the artistry of generations of women, every stitch carrying meaning. And there were games. Oh, the games. Life in the Arctic was hard, but it was not joyless, and the Inuit knew how to find delight even in the darkest months. Games were a vital part of the long winter, when families and communities had to find ways to stay close, to laugh, to keep their spirits up. Some games were tests of strength, like the 1-foot high kick, where a player had to jump up and kick a target suspended high in the air, landing on the same foot they kicked with. Some were tests of pain tolerance, like the ear pull, where two players sat across from each other with a loop of string around their ears and pulled until one gave up. Yes, it sounds strange. Yes, it was painful. But these games trained the body and the mind for the harsh demands of Arctic life. They taught endurance. They taught humor in the face of discomfort. And they brought the community together in friendly competition that strengthened bonds between people. Other games were gentler. String games, similar to what we now call cat's cradle, were played by women and children who could create intricate patterns with a single loop of sinew. Each pattern had a name, often connected to a story. Some patterns showed a polar bear, some showed a kayak, some told entire tales as the string moved from shape to shape. It was a quiet, beautiful pastime, perfect for the long evenings when the wind howled outside. Festivals brought the year to life. The most important of these was the Great Winter Festival, held during the darkest part of the year, when the sun had not been seen for weeks. Families would gather from far and wide, traveling by dog sled across the frozen sea to reach a central camp. There would be feasting, drum dancing, throat singing, storytelling, and games that lasted for days. New marriages were arranged, old friendships were renewed. Names were given to babies who had been born during the year, and in the middle of the longest darkness, the Inuit reminded themselves that they were not alone. That community, that family, that the warmth of human connection could light up even the deepest winter night. Now let us talk about something that may surprise you. Names. Among the Inuit, a name is not just a label. A name is a soul. When a baby is born, they are often given the name of a recently deceased relative or of an honored elder. With that name comes the spirit, the personality, even the relationships of the person who carried it before. A grandmother who died might return through her granddaughter, who would then be called grandmother by her own parents, in a beautiful and confusing dance of generations. This belief, called atik, meant that the dead were never truly gone. They lived on through the living, through the name, through the connection that names create. To know a person's name was to know their history. And to be given a name was to be welcomed into a long, unbroken chain of those who came before. Family itself stretched far beyond what most modern cultures would recognize. The Inuit had complex systems of kinship that connected nearly everyone in a community. Cousins were treated like siblings, aunts and uncles like second parents. Children moved freely between households, sometimes adopted by relatives or close friends in arrangements that strengthened bonds across the entire group. There was rarely such a thing as a lonely child in an Inuit camp. Every child had many parents, many grandparents, many guardians. Every adult had a duty to look after every young one. This shared parenting was not just kindness. It was insurance. In a world where any hunter might not return home, where any mother might be lost to illness, the wide net of family ensured that no child was ever truly orphaned. Marriage in the Inuit world was practical as well as personal. Couples were sometimes paired by their families when they were still young, with the understanding that a successful household needed both a strong hunter and a skilled seamstress. Without one or the other, neither could survive. Love, of course, played its part. There are countless old Inuit songs about romantic longing, about the ache of separation, about the joy of reunion. But marriage was first and foremost a partnership of skills, a contract of survival between two people who needed each other to live. And running through every part of Inuit culture, every song, every story, every carving, every game, was a single underlying thread: resilience. The Inuit did not just endure their world, they embraced it. They found beauty in the cold. They found music in the wind. They found laughter in the darkness. Outsiders, looking at the Arctic, often saw only suffering and emptiness. But the Inuit, looking at the same place, saw home. They saw the land of their ancestors. They saw the place where their songs had been sung for 1,000 years. They saw a world full of meaning, full of life, full of love. This was their culture. Not a culture of stone monuments and grand temples, but a culture carried in voices, in hands, in memory. A culture that needed no walls because it lived inside its people. And nowhere was this culture more profound, more mysterious, and more powerful than in the spiritual world that lay just beneath the surface of everyday life. A world of spirits and shamans, of sea goddesses and air gods, of ancient powers that the Inuit believed walked beside them every single day, To the Inuit, the world was never empty. Even in the deepest silence of the polar night, even in the loneliest stretch of frozen sea, they were never alone. Spirits were everywhere. In the wind that whispered across the snow, in the breath of the seal as it rose to its breathing hole, in the cracking of the ice beneath a hunter's feet, in the silent, watchful gaze of the polar bear. The Arctic, to those who could see it truly, was alive in every direction. And the Inuit, more than perhaps any other people on Earth, lived in constant daily conversation with the unseen world. At the very heart of Inuit spirituality stood a single, vast idea: sila. It is a word that does not translate easily into English because it means many things at once. Sila is the air. Sila is the weather. Sila is the sky. But sila is also wisdom. It is awareness. It is the breath of life itself, flowing through every living being. When the wind blew, Sila was speaking. When the sky cleared, Sila was calm. When the storms came, Sila was angry. The Inuit believed that Sila was the great force that connected all things, the living energy that filled the universe. To live well was to live in harmony with Sila. To break that harmony through cruelty, foolishness, or disrespect was to invite disaster. Now, alongside Sila, there were many other spirits. The Inuit world was full of them. There were spirits of animals, who watched how hunters treated their bodies. There were spirits of places, who could be helpful or dangerous depending on how they were approached. There were the souls of the dead, who lingered near their loved ones, sometimes guiding them, sometimes reminding them of debts unpaid. And then, there were the great beings, the powerful figures whose stories formed the foundation of Inuit belief. The most famous of these is Sedna, the goddess of the sea. Her story is one of the most haunting and beautiful tales in all of Indigenous tradition, and it has been told around oil lamps for countless generations. The story varies from place to place, but its heart is always the same. Sedna was once a beautiful young woman who lived with her father by the sea. She refused every suitor who came to ask for her hand, until one day a mysterious stranger arrived. He promised her a life of comfort, a warm home, and plentiful food. She agreed to marry him and traveled with him across the water to his island. But when they arrived, she discovered the terrible truth. He was not a man at all. He was a bird spirit in disguise, and his promised home was nothing but a cold, empty nest of feathers and bones. Heartbroken and frightened, Sedna called out for her father. He came in his boat to rescue her. But as they fled across the sea, the bird spirit summoned a great storm to drag them back. The waves rose, the wind howled, and Sedna's father, in his terror, made a desperate choice. He threw his daughter overboard, hoping to save himself. Sedna clung to the side of the boat with her freezing fingers. Her father, panicking, took his knife and cut off her fingers one by one. As her fingers fell into the icy sea, they transformed. The first knuckles became the seals, the second became the walrus, the third became the great whales, and Sedna herself sank to the bottom of the ocean, where she remains to this day, the mother of all sea creatures, the goddess of the deep. This story is far more than a legend. It is the spiritual core of Inuit life on the sea. Because Sedna, in the depths of the ocean, controls every animal that the Inuit must hunt to survive. When the seas are full of game, Sedna is pleased. When the hunting fails, when seals disappear and whales swim far away, the Inuit believed it was because Sedna was angry. Her long hair, tangled with the sins and wrongs of the human world, had become matted and heavy. The animals were caught in her hair, unable to swim free to the hunters. And in those terrible times when starvation crept toward the camps, only one person could help: the shaman. The shaman, in the Inuktitut language, was called the Angakuk. This was perhaps the most extraordinary figure in all of Inuit society. The Angakuk was a healer, a seer, a bridge between worlds. He or she, because women could be powerful shamans too, was chosen often by the spirits themselves. A young person might begin to have strange dreams, see visions, hear voices that others could not hear. They would then be apprenticed to an older shaman who would teach them the secret knowledge, the songs, the rituals, the dangerous arts of walking between the visible and invisible worlds. When sickness fell upon a person, when hunting failed, when storms refused to pass, the community would turn to the Angakuk. The shaman would prepare himself through fasting, through chanting, through entering a deep trance. And then, in the flickering light of the seal oil lamp, with the whole community gathered around him in the small, warm space of the snow house, he would begin his journey. His body would remain in the igloo, sometimes bound with ropes, sometimes seemingly lifeless. But his spirit would travel. He would dive to the bottom of the sea to comb the tangled hair of Sedna and beg her to release the animals. He would fly to the moon to speak with the spirits of the dead. He would wrestle with malevolent forces that had brought illness into the camp. The community would hear his voice, sometimes shouting, sometimes whispering, sometimes speaking in voices that did not seem human at all. When the journey was complete, the shaman would return. He would tell the people what he had seen, what had caused their suffering, and what they must do to make things right. Sometimes the answer was a confession. The Inuit believed that hidden wrongs, broken taboos, secret cruelties could anger the spirits and bring misfortune to the whole group. So one by one, those gathered would speak their hidden faults aloud, releasing them into the air, cleansing the community of its invisible weight. It was, in a deep way, one of the earliest forms of group therapy that humanity has ever practiced. The world of the Angakuk was not always gentle. There were dark shamans who used their powers for harm. There were spiritual battles fought between rivals across vast distances. There were tales of shamans who could turn into bears, who could fly through the air, who could survive being stabbed or drowned. Whether you believe in such things or not, what cannot be denied is the power of these beliefs in shaping Inuit life. The Angakuk gave the people a way to understand suffering, a way to face the unknown, a way to feel that even in the darkest storm, there was someone fighting on their behalf in the unseen world. Beyond Sedna and Sila, there were countless other beliefs that shaped daily behavior. Hunters followed strict rituals after a kill. A seal, for example, was given a drink of fresh water as soon as it was brought into the home. The Inuit believed the seal's spirit was thirsty after life in the salty sea, and that this small kindness would please the soul of the animal, who would then tell other seals that the hunters were good and worthy. Bones of certain animals were never broken, but returned carefully to the sea or buried in specific ways. To disrespect an animal was to insult its spirit, and an insulted spirit could ensure that no more of its kind ever came to the hunter's harpoon. There were countless taboos, called pitalinik, rules about what could be done and when. A woman could not sew caribou skins while the men were hunting walrus, because the spirits of land and sea must not be mixed. Certain foods could not be eaten in certain seasons. Certain words could not be spoken in certain places. To outsiders, these rules might have seemed strange or arbitrary, but to the Inuit, they were the careful, ancient agreements between humans and the powers of the world. Break the agreement, and the world would break in return. This was the spiritual landscape of the Inuit, a world where every breath of wind carried meaning, where the sea was a living goddess, where the shaman walked between the worlds, and where survival depended not just on the strength of the hunter, but on the harmony of the soul. It was a worldview as deep as the ocean and as wide as the sky, and it gave rise to traditions and practices so unusual, so unique to the Arctic, that the rest of the world has only recently begun to truly understand them. Every culture has its secrets. Every people, shaped by their land and their history, develops practices that seem strange to outsiders, but make perfect sense to those who live within them. The Inuit, having spent thousands of years adapting to the most extreme environment on Earth, have a treasury of such practices. Some are clever solutions to impossible problems. Some are mysterious traditions whose true origins are lost in time. And some are so unusual, so deeply tied to the Arctic itself, that they can only be understood by stepping fully inside the Inuit world. Let us begin with one of the most ingenious inventions ever created by any human society: the snow goggles. In the spring, when the sun finally returns to the Arctic after the long winter darkness, it brings with it a hidden danger. The light, reflecting off the endless white surface of the snow and ice, becomes blinding. Within hours, an unprotected hunter can suffer from snow blindness, a painful condition where the eyes feel as though they have been scraped with sand. In severe cases, it can lead to permanent damage. But the Inuit, long before sunglasses were invented anywhere else in the world, had solved this problem. They carved goggles from wood, bone, ivory, or antler. The design was beautiful in its simplicity. A small piece of material, shaped to fit snugly across the face, with two narrow slits cut into it. The slits allowed just enough light through for clear vision, while blocking the harsh, blinding glare of the sun on snow. These goggles were so effective that modern Arctic explorers have copied the design, and you can still see their influence in the design of ski and snow gear sold around the world today. Now let us turn to something far more personal and far more mysterious: the tradition of facial tattoos among Inuit women. For thousands of years, when a young Inuit woman came of age, she would receive her first tattoos. The most common were thin lines drawn down the chin, sometimes joined by markings on the forehead, the cheeks, or the hands. The process was painful and slow. A needle made of bone, threaded with sinew dipped in soot or seal oil, was pulled carefully through the skin. The marks would heal into deep, dark lines that would last a lifetime. Each pattern was different. Each one told a story. The tattoos marked important moments in a woman's life: her first menstruation, her marriage, the birth of her first child. They were a record of identity, of belonging, of strength. For most of the 20th century, this beautiful tradition was nearly destroyed. Christian missionaries arriving in Inuit communities declared the tattoos sinful and forbade them. Generations of Inuit women grew up with bare faces, their grandmothers' marks fading into memory. But in recent years, something powerful has happened. Young Inuit women, reclaiming their heritage, have begun to bring the tattoos back. They are seeking out the few elders who still remember the old patterns. They are learning the traditional methods. They are wearing the marks of their ancestors with pride. To see a young Inuit woman today, with her chin lines fresh and dark, is to witness a culture refusing to let go of itself. It is a quiet, beautiful act of resistance and resurrection. Let us turn now to something the Inuit alone in all the world possess: kiviut, the wool of the muskox. The muskox is one of the great, strange creatures of the Arctic, a shaggy, ancient-looking animal that has survived since the Ice Age. Beneath its long outer hair, it grows a layer of soft, fine wool that protects it from the brutal Arctic cold. Each spring, the muskox sheds this wool, leaving it caught on bushes and rocks across the tundra. The Inuit gather it carefully, sometimes spending days collecting just a small bagful. The wool is then spun by hand into yarn, and here is the wonder of it. Kiviut is 8 times warmer than sheep wool, softer than cashmere, and incredibly rare. A single scarf made of kiviut can sell for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. It is one of the most luxurious natural fibers on Earth, and it comes only from the windswept plains of the Arctic, gathered by the patient hands of those who know exactly where to look. There were also practices that may seem unusual to modern ears, but were perfectly logical within the Inuit world. One such practice was bone divination. When a hunter wanted to know where to find game, or when a community faced an important decision, an elder might take the shoulder blade of a caribou or the rib of a seal, hold it over a flame, and read the cracks that formed as the bone heated. The patterns were believed to reveal the answers the spirits wished to share. To outsiders, this might sound like superstition. But to the Inuit, it was a way of slowing down, of asking the question seriously, of listening to something deeper than ordinary thought. And in many cases, the answers it produced turned out to be wise. Another remarkable tradition was the ritual of the first hunt. When a young boy killed his first seal, his first caribou, his first whale, the moment was treated with enormous importance. The meat of that first kill was not eaten by the boy himself. It was given away, distributed to the elders, to the widows, to the whole community. The boy stood by, watching others enjoy what his hands had brought home. This, the Inuit believed, taught him the most important lesson of the hunter's life: that his work was not for himself, it was for others. From his very first success, he was reminded that to hunt was to provide. To be a man among the Inuit was to be a giver, not a taker. And then there is the famous gesture that the rest of the world has long misunderstood: the kunik. Outsiders have called it the Eskimo kiss, imagining it as a romantic rubbing of noses. But the kunik is something different and something deeper. It is a greeting between loved ones, between parents and children, between dear friends. The Inuit press their noses and upper lips against the face of the other person and gently breathe in. They are not just touching, they are taking in the scent of the one they love. In a land where, for most of the year, faces are the only part of the body left uncovered, where the cold makes lip-kissing impractical, the kunik became the natural language of affection. A mother greeting her child after a long day, a husband returning to his wife after weeks on the ice. The kunik is small, intimate, and utterly Inuit. It says, "Without words, you are mine, and I have missed you, and you smell like home." These are just a few of the practices that make the Inuit world so unique. Each one reveals something about how this remarkable people learned to live, to love, and to find meaning in a place that should have been unlivable. But the world that produced these traditions has been changing rapidly. And the next chapter of the Inuit story is one of struggle, of loss, and of extraordinary determination. The 20th century arrived in the Arctic like a slow-moving storm. At first, it came in small ways: a trading post here, a missionary there, a wooden church rising above a village of skin tents. But within a few short generations, the changes would transform the Inuit world more deeply than anything in their 10,000-year history. And not all of those changes were welcome. In fact, some of them would leave wounds so deep that the Inuit are still healing from them today. It began with the best of intentions, or so the outside world claimed. Governments in Canada, the United States, Denmark, and Russia decided that the Inuit needed to be modernized. They needed schools. They needed permanent towns. They needed to live the way other people lived. And so, beginning in the early to mid-1900s, families who had moved freely across the Arctic for thousands of years were gathered together and pressed into fixed settlements. The nomadic life, the seasonal travel, the rhythm of following the seals and the caribou was discouraged or sometimes forbidden outright. People who had lived under the open sky now lived in small wooden houses, often poorly built, often crowded, often far from the lands their ancestors had known. In Canada, the situation became even more painful. In the 1950s, the government carried out a series of forced relocations, moving Inuit families thousands of miles from their homelands to remote outposts in the high Arctic. The official reason was often described as helping the Inuit find better hunting grounds. The real reason, many historians now believe, was to plant Canadian flags and Canadian people in the far north, to strengthen the country's claim to those territories during the Cold War. Families were loaded onto ships, taken to lands they had never seen, and left to survive in conditions that even they, the masters of the Arctic, found brutal. Some did not make it through the first winter. Those who did never forgot what had been done to them. Then came the schools, the residential schools. For decades, Inuit children were taken from their parents, sometimes by force, and sent to boarding schools far from their communities. At these schools, they were forbidden to speak their own language. They were punished for practicing their traditions. They were taught that everything about their culture was backward, primitive, and shameful. Children who left their parents speaking fluent Inuktitut returned years later barely able to communicate with their own grandmothers. Some children suffered terrible abuse at these schools. Some never came home at all. The trauma of that era still echoes through Inuit communities today, in the silences between generations, in the struggle to reclaim words and customs that were nearly lost. And then there was perhaps the cruelest blow of all, the slaughter of the sled dogs. In the 1950s and 60s, Canadian authorities killed thousands of Inuit sled dogs across the Arctic. The official explanation was disease control and public safety. But the Inuit themselves remember it differently. They remember dogs being shot in front of weeping families. They remember the heart of their culture being torn out, animal by animal. Without their dogs, the Inuit could no longer travel as they once had. They could no longer hunt as they once had. They became dependent on snowmobiles, on store-bought food, on the cash economy of the South. Many Inuit see the killing of the dogs as a deliberate effort to break their independence, to force them into a settled, controlled way of life. The Canadian government has since formally acknowledged the harm caused by these actions, but the wounds remain. Alongside these government policies came other forces. Disease, which had begun arriving with European whalers, continued to devastate Inuit communities. Tuberculosis spread through crowded settlements. Influenza outbreaks killed entire families. Patients were sometimes taken away to southern hospitals, where they died alone, far from home, and were buried in unmarked graves that their families would spend decades trying to find. Even today, Inuit organizations are still working to bring the bodies of their lost loved ones home. Yet, even in the darkest of these years, the Inuit did not break. They adapted, as they had always adapted. They took the new tools of the modern world, the rifles, the snowmobiles, the radios, the airplanes, and they made them their own. They learned the languages of the South while quietly keeping their own alive in their homes. They sent their children to the new schools while teaching them at night the old stories that no school could ever capture. And slowly, they began to fight back. The political awakening of the Inuit in the late 20th century is one of the most inspiring stories in modern Indigenous history. Across the Arctic, Inuit leaders began to organize. They formed councils, associations, and unions. They demanded recognition. They demanded land. They demanded the right to govern themselves. And remarkably, they began to win. In 1979, Greenland achieved home rule from Denmark, giving the Inuit majority of that vast island the right to manage their own affairs. In 2009, that home rule was expanded into self-government, recognizing the Greenlandic Inuit as a distinct people with the right to decide their own future. In Canada, the struggle for Inuit land rights culminated in 1999 with the creation of Nunavut, a vast new territory carved out of the Northwest Territories. Nunavut is larger than most countries in the world. Its government is led primarily by Inuit. Its official languages include Inuktitut. It is, in many ways, the largest Indigenous-led political achievement in modern North American history. In Alaska, the Inupiat and Yupik peoples have also won significant land claims and self-governance through organizations like the Alaska Federation of Natives. And in Russia, despite enormous challenges, the Yupik communities of Chukotka continue to fight for the survival of their language and culture. But just as the Inuit were beginning to reclaim their political voice, a new and even greater threat appeared: climate change. The Arctic, scientists now know, is warming at nearly 4 times the global average. The ice that has defined the Inuit world for thousands of years is melting. Sea ice that used to form thick and stable each winter now forms late, breaks up early, and shifts unpredictably. Hunters who once read the ice like a book now find that the rules they learned from their grandfathers no longer apply. Travel routes that have been used for generations have become deadly. Communities built on permafrost are sinking as the ground beneath them thaws. Animals that have always come at certain seasons are arriving at strange times, or not arriving at all. For the Inuit, climate change is not a distant scientific debate. It is a daily reality. It is the disappearance of the world they know. Imagine your home, your neighborhood, your city, slowly dissolving beneath your feet. That is what the Inuit are facing today. And yet, even in this crisis, they are leading. Inuit voices are now among the most powerful and respected in international climate discussions. Leaders like Sheila Watt-Cloutier from Canada have stood before the United Nations and the world's parliaments, telling the story of what is happening in the Arctic, demanding action, reminding humanity that their fate is connected to the fate of the ice. At the same time, a new generation of young Inuit is rising. They are scientists, lawyers, doctors, filmmakers, musicians, and artists. They are using social media to share their culture with millions around the world. They are making films in Inuktitut that win international awards. They are recording the stories of their elders before those stories are lost. They are reviving throat singing, drum dancing, traditional tattoos, and the ancient knowledge of the land. They live in two worlds, the modern and the traditional, and they are determined to honor both. The challenges remain immense. Mental health crises, suicide rates that are tragically high, food insecurity, housing shortages, and the ongoing impact of historical trauma continue to weigh on Inuit communities. There is no pretending that all is well, but there is also no denying the strength, the brilliance, and the resilience of the Inuit people in the face of all these struggles. They have survived 10,000 years of one of the harshest environments on Earth. They have survived colonization, disease, forced relocation, and cultural suppression. And they are still here, still hunting, still singing, still telling the stories that have always told them who they are. The Inuit story is not finished, far from it. It is being written, every single day, by every Inuk who steps onto the ice, who teaches a child a word in Inuktitut, who carves a piece of soapstone, who fights for a future where their grandchildren can still live as Inuit, in the land their ancestors have always called home. So we return, at last, to where we began, to the silence, to the snow, to the great white horizon that stretches farther than the eye can see. The wind is still blowing. The stars are still wheeling above the polar night. And somewhere out there, on the edge of the frozen sea, an Inuit hunter is standing perfectly still beside a breathing hole, just as his ancestors stood 10,000 years before him. The story of the Inuit is, in many ways, the story of what human beings can become when they truly listen to the world around them. They did not conquer the Arctic. They did not fight it, or fence it, or carve it into something easier. They learned it. They loved it. They became part of it so deeply that the line between people and place almost disappeared. And in doing so, they built one of the most extraordinary cultures our species has ever known. A culture of patience, of generosity, of laughter in the dark, of songs that echo across centuries. We live in a world that often seems to value speed over patience, possession over sharing, noise over silence. The Inuit have something to teach all of us. They remind us that wisdom often grows slowly, in cold places, in long nights, in the quiet conversation between a person and the land beneath their feet. They remind us that no human being is truly alone, as long as they remember the names of those who came before. They remind us that even in the harshest world, there is room for kindness, for art, for love, for the small warmth of a kunuk shared between a parent and a child. The ice is changing now. The Arctic is changing. And the Inuit, once again, are adapting, fighting, and finding ways forward. Their story is not just their own, it belongs to all of us. Because as long as the Inuit continue to live, to sing, to remember, the human spirit itself shines a little brighter at the very top of the world.